So, Dr. Patrick Newman here, for those of you who might not be aware. He's the assistant professor of economics at South Florida College. He's the editor of several books here with the Progressive Era and Conceived in Liberty, Volume 5, both from Rothbard. Great works that those have. I actually have my copy of the Progressive Era right here on my desk right next to me. He's also the author of Cronyism, which is a fantastic book. Recommend everybody read. And he's going to be here talking with us today. So make sure you have his PowerPoint ready to go. And Dr. Newman, you can take it away.
All right. Well, thanks so much for the introduction. So as was mentioned, I'm Patrick Newman. Hopefully everyone is able to see my PowerPoint. I apologize for sending this PowerPoint out a little late. I'd asked ChatGPT to write me a PowerPoint on the history of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, and it gave me something talking about how good the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. I'm going to have to do this the old-fashioned way, right? The old-fashioned way of a couple months ago of actually writing it out. No. All right. Anyway, so I have this old PowerPoint, really just something to follow along, a lot of interesting pictures, something that we could look at while I'm going on here. So the title of my talk is Crusading Against Adulteration, A History of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. This is part of a larger project that I'm working on. I've written a book on cronyism, liberty versus power in early America, 1607 to 1849. I'm currently working on the sequel book over the next 100 years. It starts in 1849. The 1949 is a little bit up in the air. Could easily go into the early 50s, still working on that. I'm right around the 1920s. I started writing it this year, making very good progress. So I'd like it to be available in 2024, but we'll see what happens. Chapter 8 is purifying the competition. And this chapter goes through a wide variety of topics related to the move by various special interests in the progressive era to reform our nation's health and drug laws and so on and so forth, right? So I know I didn't mention this, but before going on further, just like to state that, well, cronyism is about special interests, right? It's about special interest policies more specifically, right? So how special interests use the government to obtain various laws to their advantage, things like protective tariffs, subsidies, and so on. And this extends to various food and drug laws, right? We think of these laws, or most people think of these laws as being essential, something that we need, something that is necessary in order to prevent people from poisoning food that they sell to little children, and so on and so forth, etc. And what this chapter tries to do is it tries to show that, well, a lot of those laws that were created in the early 1900s really just intended to benefit, really ended up just benefiting certain special interests. The 1906 Meat Inspection Act benefited the Beef Trust. The Pure Food and Drug Act, which we'll be talking about today, benefited various food companies as well as doctors and pharmacists like the American Medical Association. And then I've got a final section on the American Medical Association and how it lobbied for state laws to restrict various medical colleges, the granting of licenses to try and prohibit various competing types of doctors, homeopaths, eclectics. The AMA in the early 1900s was also very against chiropractors and optometrists, which I find very funny. But anyway, that's a slightly different conversation. So I will be talking about the Pure Food and Drug Act, right? And the general thesis of my section and really this presentation is that food companies, or certain food companies, as well as doctors, lobbied for the law to hurt competitors. Right? They were behind the law. It wasn't really a story of the public interest crusaders of fighting for the public. It was for special interests pushing for this law because they wanted to get various restrictions on what their competitors could do, as I'll talk about. Restrictions regarding labeling, restrictions regarding certain ingredients used in food and drugs, so on and so forth. And this law was, or the passage of this law was supported by the chief of the Bureau of Chemistry, Harvey Washington Wiley. For those of you who don't know who Harvey Washington Wiley is, well, we'll be talking more about him in the one sentence the elevator pitch is that he's basically like the Anthony Fauci of 100 years ago, right? That's obviously Harvey Washington Wiley on the right. And the Bureau of Chemistry in the Department of Agriculture was the agency that enforced the Pure Food and Drug Act. And this, in 1927, became the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration. And then in 1930, it became the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, as the organization we all know and love. If you're wondering, wait, the Food and Drug Administration also looked at insecticides early on. Yep, that's true. But then it kind of switched gears. All right, and then Wiley used the law to, well, try to benefit the special interests he represented, trying to push for various restrictions that would hurt these various competitors of the special interests. And Wiley also made a good amount of money in the process. So he's like a lot of bureaucrats, where he's able to use the law to benefit various interests as well as himself. And then he retires and he continues to do this, or he's rewarded by these special interests, the so-called revolving door, right? It's people today, they still think, they say, well, you got to have government protect people against COVID. You got to have government protect people against problems in food. Otherwise, we just have to look back at what the world was like 100 years ago. And that's a strong argument a lot of people use to justify modern government intervention. And I think it's important, and it's really healthy. We have to look at, okay, is that history actually true? And my answer is that no, it's not true. Okay. So what was a big problem about 120 years ago? Or this is a problem according to various companies. It was a problem known as adulteration, right? Adulteration referred to the making of a product using a substitute ingredient. It's basically the most banal, or the most neutral way of describing it, right? It's someone putting in filler into a product or something else, right? With food, okay? So, for example, instead of using sugar or raw sugar to make honey, you could use corn syrup, right? We've got sugar cubes on the left, the next slide, and then we've got corn syrup on the right, okay? So the makers of sugar, or various the growers of raw sugar, so everything of sugarcane producers in Louisiana, in Florida, the makers of beet sugar, the makers of sorghum, etc., they were very anti-corn syrup, because corn syrup is made from potatoes and corn, right? And it's originally it was called glucose, right? Corn syrup was just, as we'll talk about later, just a nice label for it. And they said, well, this is fraudulent. This is unhealthy. This is you can't make candy with corn syrup, so on and so forth. And what it really was is it was an attack on competition, right? Your corn syrup is a lot cheaper, and a lot of people preferred those products because they were cheaper and with extra flavors, etc., so on and so forth, right? So this is seen as a big problem by the growers of raw sugar and so on. Okay. Now, these arguments regarding adulteration were always dressed up in terms of the public interest, saying something's not healthy for you. All right, something's dangerous, something's poisonous for you. Well, two things come to mind. Well, one, it's the consumer's job to decide, or it's the consumer's right to decide what's healthy. And even if something is unhealthy, does that mean they should be prohibited from buying it? And the bigger thing is that, well, a lot of these other products were cheaper. So, sometimes people, especially back then when living standards were a lot lower, you're going to purchase products that have various preservatives in it. It's cheaper. A big thing, an equally big thing, is that, well, a lot of these products weren't actually unhealthy, or at least unhealthy by then contemporary standards. It was just a different way of making a product. As another example, for those of you who are alcohol drinkers or whiskey people, straight whiskey, right, such as the maker of Old Tailor on the left, they were very against the makers of the products of rectified whiskey products. Excuse me. So straight whiskey is whiskey that's basically developed the old-fashioned way. It's aged in some sort of oak barrel. And rectified whiskey, it was made in a lab. And when you think of a lab back then, it's not necessarily guys in, the the white jackets and everything. You're in some sort of industrial lab, like you're, a Budweiser manufacturing plant or something. Blended whiskey was whiskey that's similar to rectified whiskey. It had some straight whiskey, but then it was mixed in with other spirits, diluted. Okay, most consumers back then, especially those in working class saloons, drank rectified whiskey or blended whiskey. Why? Well, it didn't taste much different, and it was also cheaper. Okay, straight whiskey was used, was drank by connoisseurs, wealthy gentlemen, the people who really like to taste the minute differences in whiskey and sip on it casually, etc. The straight whiskey producers, they had wanted to basically cripple rectified whiskey by getting some sort of label on it that said it wasn't actually whiskey, or it was fraudulent whiskey, saying that, well, it's a cheap knockoff and it's misleading consumers because you're not actually getting whiskey, right? And of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and what exactly is whiskey is, well, that's up for consumers to decide, right? So that's another example. A further example would be the baking powder wars. Baking powder back then was used in a lot of bread, right? So women at the household, baking powder was used in bread, and it would make it a lot easier to make bread. And anyway, it was just something that was used. The Royal Baking Powder Company, shown on the left, made baking powder from cream of tartar, which is like a type of powder. Okay, and they were very anti alum baking powder, right? And they had pushed for all sorts of ads and restrictions. They had ads such as on the right saying, "Well, other countries prohibit it. You can only buy Royal Baking Powder bread. Excuse me, not bread. You can only buy the baking powder sold by the Royal Baking Powder Company." Okay. And again, even though they said it was health arguments, you had many scientists back then say that, well, no, it's just a different way of making the product, or it's really only unhealthy if you're having it in very high dosages, stuff like that. But the big difference is that alum baking powder sold for 1/5 the price of cream of tartar baking powder, which obviously would really hurt Royal Baking Powder's sales. Okay. For a company that I'm sure everyone has heard of, Heinz, right? It was known as the H.J. Heinz Company. It's famous for making ketchup and other condiments, etc. In the early 1900s, it had developed a type of ketchup that did not rely on sodium benzoate, which is a type of preservative. And it was supposed to be, well, our ketchup is high quality, it's natural, etc. We want to prohibit, we support laws that prohibit sodium benzoate, a type of preservative used in lower quality ketchups, and they wanted to get rid of it. They wanted to basically hurt those ketchup producers. On the right, there's a picture of some Indian ketchup. It's authentic Indian tomato ketchup, and lo and behold, it's got sodium benzoate. So that preservative would, or that ketchup would not be allowed to exist, according to Heinz. Ironically, a lot of Heinz ketchup now utilizes corn syrup. But that's something that we can overlook. But the point is, it's that they also wanted restrictions on their competitors. The Heinz company, they wanted everyone to only be able to make ketchup using a very expensive process, or basically using a certain type of bottle where the ketchup wouldn't rot, etc. Right? We can go to the doctors. A big issue at this time was so-called patent medicines. Right? These were medicines that you could basically purchase at a grocery store, just a regular place where you can get other goods, and they contained drugs that were seen as dangerous by various other doctors. Right, you've seen some ads on the right: cocaine tooth drops, cannabis indica, asthma cigarettes, Miss Winslow's soothing syrup. Right, and people would criticize these for saying, well, consumers don't know what's in them, or there's misleading amounts of stuff that's in them, and these are dangerous ingredients. These were most frequently brought up by doctors, who I'm trying to show on the left, particularly the American Medical Association Association and the American Pharmaceutical Association. These doctors weren't so concerned with the actual use of these drugs because they prescribed these drugs to their patients. They prescribed cocaine. They prescribed whiskey for people when they're having pain problems. They just wanted to be in control of selling these drugs to consumers. The state of medical knowledge back then was much more limited compared to now. Aspirin had only been developed in 1899. And most pain medications, including those by doctors, involved drugs that we would consider dangerous: cocaine, alcohol, etc., and so on. Medical standards were not so advanced back then. This picture from a recent TV show shows some doctors operating on a patient. Notice how their hands are all bloody. Doctors did not take care of their of minimizing the spread of germs, sanitizing surgical equipment, and so on. So a lot of their practices were just as dangerous, right? And the big thing is that these patent medicines were stuff that consumers preferred. This was something that they would go to. Think of these as like a 5-hour energy drink now. There was various 5-hour energy drinks back then. They involved cocaine and alcohol. But again, that's what you had to use if you wanted to be effective. There was, of course, other types of medical producers, homeopaths, eclectics, so the people who gave herbal remedies, etc. The AMA was also against those, but that's a whole different conversation. And then there's one final group. There was the women, particularly the evangelical reformers, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the General Federation of Women's Clubs. They were against food and drug adulteration because they thought it was sinful. They thought that they had to remake the world. And in order to bring about the Jesus's return, they had to stamp out sin, and they supported this type of law because they were, they wanted to get rid of alcohol. They wanted to get rid of ethnic American food, ethnic immigrant food like Italian pasta, French margarine, etc. And these women were very, very important in this drive because they were kind of the shock troops. They were the specialized infantry. They were the ones who would write letters to congressmen, bombarding them about this, or lobbying in various local town hall meetings, et cetera, so on and so forth. Okay. So Harvey Washington Wiley, he's the head of the Bureau of Chemistry. This was created in the 1880s. It would later have charge over the over the Pure Food and Drug Act. But it was a separate entity, or it was basically a sub-bureaucracy in the Department of Agriculture. He was pro-natural food. Food had to be naturally made, according to him. He would basically be a fan of what we consider organic food, right? And he wanted to prohibit other types of food. He was very anti-food that included preservatives, right? Ironically, he was okay with salicylic acid, which is used to preserve various fruits and vegetables. This was basically the one preservative he was a fan of, and it's because he invested in it. So most of these other types of preservatives, benzoate, sodium benzoate, etc., they were substitutes for salt, or using excessive amounts of salt, and they were used to basically keep a product storable. Right? We've been able to gradually get rid of a lot of these preservatives through better refrigeration, but that's something that takes time to develop. There are still some food that when we buy at the store, we have to use it relatively quickly. You buy raw chicken breast or chicken thighs, you got to freeze that thing within a day or two, or else the chicken just goes bad, right? Anyway, Wiley was allied with a lot of interests that would benefit from a pure food and drug law. He had worked with the Louisiana Sugar Producers Association, the American Beet Sugar Association, as well as sugar and coffee entrepreneur John Arbuckle. Okay. And all of those groups were against corn syrup. He was also close with the makers of Old Tailor whiskey. Wiley himself was a big whiskey connoisseur. He bought straight whiskey for the Cosmos Club. This was this elite DC club that he participated in. He would go to all these high-end restaurants that would only have straight whiskey, so only the best of liquors and not the low-end rail rum or the cheap stuff that you get at a college bar or something like that. He also had many friends with the Royal Baking Powder Company, and there's actually some pretty damning letters from him of him writing to some of these associates saying, like, he's complaining about his monetary situation. He's saying, can you cook up some scheme to get me into some sort of money-making job? Like, actually, he wrote that. Pretty damning. He also knew officials at the H.J. Heinz Company. Okay. He was on the AMA's Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry. His the head of the drug analysis at the Bureau of Chemistry, which we'll talk about in a couple slides, was he was connected with the AMA and the APA, right? So he was linked himself. And then he was also very close with Alice Lakely of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and Alice Lakely proclaimed Wiley a Moses given to the people by God. So she was willing to fight for Wiley's law. Okay. All right. So the actual passage of the law, the law itself, the Pure Food and Drug Act, there are many types of bills that were pushed in Congress. In the early 1900s, Wiley was supporting all of them, or really just those laws that would benefit his Bureau of Chemistry at the expense of other agencies. So Wiley fought down laws that would have created a new independent agency. Wiley wanted all of the power of the Pure Food and Drug Law to reside in his bureau, or at least the actual inspection parts. Okay. The only reason we have this law was in early 1906, there was this hysteria over meat inspection. It's a totally different story, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Upton Sinclair writes this screed against the Beef Trust, the Jungle, and there's this whole outcry. And it's only in June 30th, 1906, that a meat inspection law is signed. The Pure Food and Drug Act is signed the same day. And it really was able to get through Congress. By spring of 1906, it seemed very unlikely Congress would pass such a law, but it was only due to all the uproar over meat inspection that Congress quickly rammed through a bill. And there's always difficulty passing this bill because enough special interests had fought against it. Right, the makers of corn syrup had fought against the Pure Food and Drug Law. Condiment producers that use sodium benzoate. Makers of patent medicines, they would always fight down these laws, but it was only, these legislative proposals, right? But sometimes the best time to pass a law is during a crisis, or at least a purported crisis, and that's what happened with the Pure Food and Drug Act. All right, so this law prohibited adulterated and misbranded foods and drugs in interstate commerce, right? And this basically meant is that companies had to adhere to various labeling requirements, so they couldn't label foods incorrectly, or at least what was considered incorrectly by government officials. And if the government considered something adulterated, then companies would have to change, right? And again, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. What exactly counts as adulteration or misbranding is very subjective. Patent medicines also had the label alcohol, opium, cocaine, and other drugs. There was no limit on the amount. So it did nothing to actually stop patent medicines. This came about through a later law in legal rulings, basically restricting how much alcohol, opium, cocaine you could have. Right, but all it said is these types of medications, they just had to label the specific amounts of alcohol. It has 30% alcohol. This has 2 grams of cocaine, something like that. Hopefully it doesn't have 2 grams. You've got 2 grams of cocaine medication. You're doing pretty good. All right. The law was very vague. Wiley's Bureau could determine various violations. It was in charge of inspecting samples of food, of basically figuring out, okay, is this adulterated? Is this not adulterated? Is this mislabeling? Is this not mislabeling? The final authority for deciding whether it counted as adulteration or not resided with the president, then President Theodore Roosevelt, as well as the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Secretary of the Treasury, and the Secretary of what was known as the Department of Commerce and Labor back then. But so you got this sort of higher tribunal ruling over Wiley. But then any food companies or makers of drugs that were considered to have violated the law, they were subject to trial, and then courts determined the punishment. Right. Ultimately, Wiley was successful in some battles, others not so much, and this was because his very abrasive personality. He kind of alienated people, and people thought he was accruing too much power. And there were, of course, other food companies that very rightfully argued that Wiley's rulings or his decisions were very biased, right, or tendentious, right? It was just it became clear that he was just kind of using his position as a cudgel to destroy, or at least to try to destroy, various companies, right? All right, so Wiley goes on the attack, right? One of his first, as he's very against corn syrup, right? Because corn syrup, right around this time, it started to be directly marketed to consumers. Before, it was just sold as glucose to consumers, and it was basically, it was just sold as glucose to the producers of food, who then, sold it to consumers. Instead, this company, the corn products refining company, started selling it to consumers. You can see this ad on the right. You can use it to enhance various biscuits, cookies, candy, whatever. And Wiley was against this. He took a very literal definition of labels. So he was against corn syrup. He said it has to refer to juice from corn, right? Which is like ridiculous. Literally imagine taking like a corn stalk, and like squeezing it to get this juice out. And he's like, that's only what corn syrup can refer to. He was very particular. If something said boneless cod, he said it had to have 0% bone, even though it was generally understood in the industry that it couldn't have, it could have some bones in it. Wiley was very biased. Like, for example, he was okay with Heinz's company, India Relish, even though it wasn't from India. Okay, but he was close with that company. So Wiley's view on labeling caused someone to say that, well, Wiley could only insist on something being called lady fingers if it's the result of absolute mayhem. Like, you're actually selling some lady's finger, when lady fingers is clearly, it refers to a type of biscuit, a type of sweet. But anyway, so Wiley says you can't call it corn syrup, you got to call it glucose. And this is just an ugly name. It's hard to sell it to consumers. Consumers back then, they associated glucose with glue, right? The makers of corn syrup wanted to refer to it as corn syrup and also associate it with sugar, refer to it as sugar. It's a type of sugar. Eventually, basically, it was decided that corn syrup makers have to label it as corn syrup. You don't have to label it as glucose. Roosevelt ruled over Wiley because Roosevelt said, well, my son likes corn syrup, so screw Wiley. And you also can't call this corn syrup sugar, right? This was a competitive disadvantage to sugar, to corn syrup, because sugar did not have to be labeled, right? So someone would buy a product and they would see, oh, it's got corn syrup added, but if it has sugar or added sugar, that didn't have to be labeled, and that lasted for several decades, right? So Wiley kind of screws corn syrup for a while. Related to sugar, Wiley attacks America's finest beverage, right? Coca-Cola. Wiley was very anti-added caffeine, right? He was fine with added sugar, and he was also fine with coffee, right? Which includes, quote, natural caffeine, right? Wiley, if you guys remember, was also close to a sugar and coffee entrepreneur, John Arbuckle, right? Coca-Cola had recently switched sugar suppliers, that's a typo, from Arbuckle to another company, right? Wiley was very against Coca-Cola because it had added caffeine, right? Coca-Cola originally had amounts of cocaine, but they had taken cocaine out. Wiley was against Coca-Cola because it had caffeine. He was also against the label. He thought it was misleading because it had a picture of a coca leaf. And he said, well, you're not using the whole coca leaf, so this must be inaccurate, right? So Wiley seizes some of Coca-Cola's supplies, and this costly litigation continues until 1917, in which Coca-Cola basically agrees to pay to the cost of trial and agrees to reduce the amount of caffeine in its drinks. And this continued litigation made people believe caffeine in soda is less healthy than caffeine in coffee and tea, right? Which is not true. You can easily become addicted to caffeine by drinking coffee and tea. Plenty of people have, you could say, have that problem. Of course, it's a choice by them, but it's not, less dangerous now. Is coffee a healthier drink than Coca-Cola? Maybe in certain respects, but again, it's strictly about the caffeine. You can get just as addicted to caffeine based off of soda than coffee and tea than you can with soda, right? But this is just an example of Wiley's sort of bias. He was known to be a heavy coffee drinker, and he was also known to be connected with a lot of sugar interests. And he goes against Coca-Cola when it competes with coffee, and it also switched sugar supplies from John Arbuckle, which is nothing was ever directly proven on that, but it's a little damning where you're going like, okay, all right, what are you doing here, pal? Wiley also moves against various patent medicines. There's a very famous one back then. It was called Cure for Headache Brain Food, right? Which is Cure for Headache Brain Food, right? I've got it, actually spelt out. The bottle that I've on the right side of the slide that I flipped over, if you squint or you read it, you can see Harper Cure for Headache Brain Food is created by this guy whose last name was Harper. I think it was Robert Harper. And this bottle is probably taken. It's a picture from some museum, some taxpayer-supported museum. I don't know, someplace in Washington, D.C. This is one of the big trials against a drug maker during Wiley's time. A big sticking point was that, well, this drug, the label said it had 30% alcohol when it really only included 24%. And this is seen as very damning. It's a clear example of how companies would lie, right? They would cheat. They'd say, well, this contains X percent of this ingredient, but they're really deceiving the consumer, and this is why you need wise stewards at the Food and Drug Administration to stop this type of behavior, right? It also included a certain was considered a poison, acetylene, something like that, that Wiley was also against. And Wiley also said that, well, it wasn't brain food and it didn't cure headaches. All right, there's this costly trial. The company brought up several cogent points. One of them was that, well, apparently the Bureau of Chemistry doesn't know the difference between commercial alcohol and pure alcohol. Commercial alcohol is only 95% pure. Labels match up. They also had many. They brought in various scientists and experts to testify. Okay, the drug used, it's not a poison. They had people testify. People from the Major League of Baseball testify. Oh, it helps with headaches. Some senators testified on this, saying like, "Hey, this is just a product that people use." Am I saying this is healthy from modern standards? No. If you have a headache, you probably shouldn't take something that includes, like 25% alcohol. But, you can do you. Some people do that. But again, that's what you had back then. They were still found guilty, and they had to pay a fine, and their product was restricted, etc. This was a big win for the AMA and the American Pharmaceutical Association, because they'd wanted to restrict these types of drugs. They didn't want people buying drugs on their own. They wanted people buying drugs from them. And well, lo and behold, the chief chemist in their drug division, all right, Wiley was technically the chief chemist, but the Bureau of Chemistry, the person who headed their drug division was Lyman Keebler, and he was a member of both organizations. And he was big in this lawsuit against the Cure for Headache Brain Food. And you're going like, well, I wonder why. It's a huge coincidence, right? Wiley couldn't secure a lasting ban on sodium benzoate or aluminum baking powder, and he also failed to prevent rectified whiskey makers from calling their products whiskey. Ironically, afterwards, Wiley became a prohibition advocate. In the 18th Amendment, which he supported, that actually led to a dangerous adulteration of whiskey. Right, when people were legally trying to produce whiskey, they're mixing it with industrial alcohol stuff that would actually be poisonous, right? But Wiley wasn't successful in all of his endeavors, but he did get some. He did help some special interests. And most importantly, from the perspective of a bureaucrat, Wiley made a lot of money. Right? For someone who was quoted in a magazine article as saying, "I have never tried to make money," Wiley must be the best, most fortuitous, I guess you could say, the luckiest people alive. He left the Bureau in 1912. At the time, his wealth was reportedly $300,000. And you're going like, well, how? The guy made $5,000 a year. Who's his investment advisor? Well, he got this money from investments in D.C. and Maryland real estate. So he had bought around the D.C. sprawl, the growing D.C. sprawl. He had property in Loudoun County. For those of you who don't know, Loudoun County it's where all the evil people live, to be honest. I know it's being a little mean, but it's right outside of D.C. All of the big lobbyists, the wealthy lawyers, special interests, et cetera. They have these palatial palatial mansions in Loudoun County. And then he also received payments from various companies that he did consulting for, or that he helped hurt their competitors, such as John Arbuckle. Afterwards, in the classic illustration of the revolving door, he worked for Good Housekeeping magazine to basically rate various products. He got paid $10,000 a year from that magazine, so it was more than his $5,000 a year from the Bureau of Chemistry. And he also went on lucrative speaking tours. In one 9-day stint, he collected about $1,600. That was good money back then. Okay, this is right around the Federal Reserve, so this is the Fed hasn't inflated away completely, but he made a lot of money, so he did good, right? And I guess the general conclusion is that the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 is crony, right? It's legislation that benefits special interests at the expense of the public, and Wiley used it to benefit those special interests as well as himself. And you should also buy Cronyism when it comes out. I'm hoping it'll come out in 2024. And if you haven't read the first one, please read it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Absolutely. A few questions here for you. I'll take my moderator privilege, ask the first question. I'm just curious to what degree there was an attempt to try to sway popular opinion among all these different Wiley's different schemes here of trying to persuade the public that these different natural foods are good, whereas preservatives are bad. Was like the media class or different journalists in on this as well? You showed some like the advertisements and things like that. Was it mostly the companies, or were there different other individuals involved with this as well? How exactly did that entire dynamic work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some publishers supported the muckrakers and the sort of the sensationalists who would argue there were various problems, and they wanted to make money. They wanted to support the sensationalism. The big sort of battle in the press was waged by a lot of women's groups. I'd mentioned this. They were sort of the shock troops, and Wiley had tried to coordinate with them to write various letters, opinions, editorials in magazines, write to their congressmen, etc. A big thing is that, and this was, I have various quotes of these interests complaining, the public at large didn't really care. The public valued price over quality, right? Or at least purported quality, because it's sort of subjective. They really only supported this after the hysteria of the jungle, right? And thinking that, rats are getting thrown into meat and people are getting thrown into meat products, et cetera. So really the public was kind of apathetic regarding a food and drug law for a long period of time, though Wiley and the various special interests, they did try to influence the public through popular forums.
All right, I have another question here. Similar to your discussion of food and drug, discusses the tainting of drugs and alcohol with the rise of prohibition. It seems like government intervention decreases not only the quantity but also quality. Is this related to is this related to the necessity to reduce production costs in the face of government imposed costs, or is it some separate
It's a great
phenomenon?
question. Prohibition generally does lead to lower quality products. A part of it is you're trying to find some way of reducing your costs. When the government adds more costs on, you're going to try to maintain profit margins by using an inferior product. Okay. If the price of something has gone up or it's now prohibited, you're going to try to make money by selling it. It was diluted, so you're selling cocaine. It's diluted with baking powder. You're trying to sell alcohol. You maybe have stored a couple bottles of whiskey before it was prohibited, and instead you're going to make money by mixing that whiskey with medicinal alcohol or something like industrial alcohol, and it's more dangerous. And also, there's just less competitive pressure, especially if you're a company, you have an advantage in the underground economy, aka using force, dealing in crime, etc. You can produce shoddier products because you know there's going to be less of a competitive pressure, right? Or you can use violence to intimidate someone else. And this is exactly what happened with alcohol when it was prohibited in the 1920s. It was only then when alcohol became very dangerous, alcohol deaths started to rise, etc., because alcohol started to be made more dangerously mixed in with poison, so on and so forth.
All right, we've had a few people talking about and asking questions about root beer in the conference chat here. So, why is it that we call root beer today whenever sassafras was banned under the Delaney Amendment?
Good question. I believe root beer, it was named, the guy's name was his last name was root beer. I thought. I could be totally wrong on that. I remember reading that, but I am not sure. I don't know the root beer history, but so I could be wrong with that, but I'm not sure particularly why it has to be called root beer.
All right, we have another question here. Question about sort of the method and the way that you write all these different books and things. So, what is your process in researching for all these books, and where do you look for crony connections first? How do you track down all these perverse interests, and how do you get data on how much all these different people profited off of all the various schemes?
That's a great question. It really involves a lot of reading, a lot of looking at books with this type of information. So I try to read everything on Harvey Washington Wiley, both old and new. Sometimes this information, for example, how much Wiley makes, is sort of just briefly discussed, and it is or just casually mentioned, oh, Wiley made this amount of money, because the biography is very favorable towards Wiley. And you go like, wait a second, that's actually important. Let me look at this more. Also try to look at archives. I can get evidence, I can get information from letters. There are various search engines regarding, you can look at newspaper clippings from 100 years ago and searching for certain keywords that I try to look at, and so forth. So really just try to collect a lot of data. Then you're trying to look at, all right, who are the relevant players? Who are the people who could have benefited from something? Now, just because they could have benefited doesn't mean they actually benefited, but it does provide an opening, or at least just an introductory investigation that we can look into. And you try and follow the trail, see if something comes up. You try to look at, all right, Harvey Washington Wiley, how could he have benefited? Did he benefit? Was he connected with any special interests? So on and so forth. And also, I think I just looked online. Apparently, the maker of root beer, his last name was not Root. But anyway, it was a worthwhile guess.
Next question here is, what in your opinion was Rothbard's greatest advance in production theory over Mises? And on a related note, when will The Makings of a Misesian Economist be out?
Great question. I think Rothbard's best advancement of production theory over Mises had to do with, well, he actually used utilized Hayekian production theory. And the Hayekian triangle, which is built off of Bomberg's concentric circles. So Rothbard really analyzing the structure of production, the various stages of production, and showing how it's linked with the time preference theory of interest. And Rothbard really focuses on the capitalist entrepreneur. It's in Mises. It's not as up in front. So I think that's a big thing. Mises does have the structure production, but he mentions some of Hayek's stuff, but it's not really integrated. There was the one time someone, I think Rothbard, asked Mises a question on Hayek's structure of production, or how he would graphically represent the structure of production, and Mises drew like a square. And Rothbard didn't really know how to go from that. And I think that was something Frank Fetter had tried to do. But I consider the structure of production, his advancements, utilizing what Hayek wrote regarding all of the stages, etc. That's his biggest thing. Making a Misesian economist. We're done with the first draft. We had some very helpful comments from people reading the manuscript. One of them was Jonathan Newman, who's also a presenter at this conference. We're hoping to finish it this year, and we'd love for it to be available in early 2024. We'd like to see if we can go to a couple of archives, but it is in progress. There is a structure of production regarding it, but we are moving along.
All right, next question here. Previous to writing Cronyism, you had worked on editing the Progressive Era and the 5th volume of Conceiving in Liberty. So after those two projects, what inspired you to take on Cronyism and start writing
It's
that?
a great question. Long story short, a donor at the Mises Institute had asked me to write a book on the history of crony capitalism. So I said, okay, well, I can do that. I'm very interested in that. Some of that related to Progressive Era, Constitution, etc. And I decided to kind of make it multiple books, basically because this is something that involves a lot of research, a lot of time. I didn't want to be stuck 10 years on one project or one book. I'd rather publish it in a process, or basically in multiple stages. And that's basically been my current calling right now, is just writing about the history of special interest policies. My goal is, after this book, I write a book carrying it up to the present day. Right? A lot of the methods I use will be different, in that obviously you won't be looking at old letters or newspaper clippings. You'll be looking at trying to look at internet articles, tweets, etc. But I think I can write about the post-World War II era up through COVID in one volume. So I'd like it to be a 3-volume work, but this is something that a Mises Institute donor, Hunter Lewis, had asked me to embark upon, and that's it. I've been doing that ever since.
Do you have any plans for other books that you might embark on after finishing your Cronyism trilogy, or are you just focused on finishing that for now?
Yeah. I've got various other book projects that I'd like to do. One thing that Joe Salerno and I would like to do, and we're planning on doing this after we get done with the making of a Misesian economist, is to write a textbook on price theory. Not trying to write a treatise, but just trying to write a textbook, a couple 100-page textbook on what is the correct theory of pricing from an Austrian perspective. How do you derive demand curves? How is the Austrian what's called causal realist perspective different than other approaches, so on and so forth. So we'd like to work on that. I also would like to write a one book, a standalone book, History of Thought, basically trying to write what Rothbard originally aimed to do, which is history of thought from the beginning up through the modern era. So we want to elaborate on what Rothbard discussed after Volume 2. Unfortunately, there's no real evidence Rothbard started the 3rd volume. He just had some lecture notes on it, and I think that's a missing gap. But so really trying to fill out what Rothbard called the science of liberty, so his connection among all of the disciplines: economics, economic history, history of economic thought, etc. I'd like to write books in those various fields. So economic theory, economic history, and history of economic thought. My plan is just to keep on going. So just be like the Energizer Bunny. Hopefully have a book every 2 years, something like that.
Sounds fantastic. One other question here. Whenever you read lots of other history books, specifically history books covering sort of the progressive era and things like that, things that you were talking about in your presentation today, a lot of the treatments of these kinds of eras are very ideological in nature. You have a lot of these historians that think that, oh, these things were fantastic, they were great, and they completely ignore all this, the cronyism aspect of it here that you're examining in your upcoming book. So my question is just, why is it that so often these historians take these ideological views of things, sort of these rose-colored glasses whenever they're examining history that they would never do whenever they're examining other topics or even modern-day events?
Yeah, they get paid to do that. I mean, that's kind of they're sort of they're the so-called court intellectuals or the court historians. There's an agreement between the rulers and the intellectuals. It's been like this since time immemorial, so to speak. You've got the king. He's got to convince the public that everything he does is just. You have to fight for the king. You have to die for the king. You have to give 10% of your crops to the king. So what does he do? Well, he pays the priest. He gives the priest a nice church. He says, look, we'll build you a church, but you have to justify everything that I'm doing to the public, right? You have to put a good spin on it. Historians, it's the same way. They get money from the government, right? And then they write books, generally a pro-government bias. Okay. And so they work at government universities that receive large amounts of subsidies from the federal government and state governments. They get research grants through various organizations that are taxpayer supported. They could work directly for the government, so on and so forth. And this is, I know it sounds, well, that's just being biased yourself, but this is actually how the history of various professions evolved. I do talk about this in my book. The American Economics Association, which was founded in 1885, was explicitly originally when it was created by Richard T. Ely and other people to be pro-intervention and anti-laissez-faire. One of the stated reasons was because advocating laissez-faire doesn't really lead to any room for policy analysis. You just say, let the market do it. There's no room for economists to be hired by governments advising and planning various things. There's also no need to for governments to give research grants, etc. Most professors, most economists in the 1800s in America, they generally worked at liberal arts colleges in the 1800s. And then a lot of them, starting in the 1870s, 1880s, they go to Germany to get PhDs. This is where you went to get PhDs back then. They go to the University of Berlin, other places where, if you know your history of economic thought, the German Historical School taught at. These were very interventionist environments. It was basically teaching people on how to be advisors to governments. So these various economists, such as Richard T. Ely and other people, they go to Germany, they get their PhDs. They say, hey, this is great. We need to replicate this in the United States. We need government universities. We need graduate programs, and we need to start advocating this stuff so we can get jobs. That's what the AEA was partially behind. Johns Hopkins University became one of the first, I think it was the first graduate degree granting institution in the United States. And the whole development of higher education in just writing a lot of this type of pro-government works is directly related to this movement. It's a way of justifying your worth. Historians can really only make a good living by advocating for various state policies. Okay, you work at a small college, or you write on your own. How great the free market is, you're not going to make that much money. But beginning in the late 1890s, early 1900s, the intellectuals, they started to shift.
All right. So one last question here. For any prospective economic students that are looking to get into taking their economic skills and applying to history, as you have done in your own works, what kind of advice would you give to them? Do you have any pointers? Is there anything that you would tell them that they need to watch out for?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the first thing I would say is you have to read The second thing I would say is you have to read. And the third thing I would say is you have to read. Okay. You should read before you write, though you should always be trying to write too. But you have to be very informed. You have to constantly be reading. You have to also be honing your skills writing early on. I originally wrote on, forums. The old Mises forum of way back in the day. It was kind of like Discord is now, or then initially Facebook, and then you start writing articles, etc. If you're trying to focus on history, the history market right now is very tough. It's academic wise. You get a PhD in history, a good job is teaching at a private high school. Okay, and this is not a criticism of historians. It's just how saturated the market is. The demand for those degrees are not growing. And what is growing is generally very gender, race, class type of history analysis, right? So if you can focus on the economic side, or at least have some job, or you're able to get a job doing it, that's important. But really trying to focus on topics that, one, you know a lot about, and two, you can also write stuff that other people haven't written on. So initially, I started writing about business cycles, the history of business cycles, etc. Then moved into cronyism. It's about, figuring out, can you write something that other people are interested in, and do you have something to add to the discussion? And I'm happy to talk with whoever asked this about it more. But it's just make sure you're reading a lot. You got to read both Austrian stuff and non-Austrian stuff, or the history you agree with and the history you disagree with, and figuring out, all right, what stories can I tell? The most important thing to be a successful academic or just successful writer is creativity. You have to have ideas, and you have to have lots of them.
All right. Sounds fantastic. Thank you very much for being here with us today, Dr. Newman. We appreciate it very much.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me.